Hi, welcome to Gene Rants. I'm Gene, and today I'm turning the floor over to Tom Cotton, Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, on a very important, well, this is an important video. It's 8 minutes. It has to do with Israel, this constant criticism that Israel is getting about whether Israel is providing sufficient aid, humanitarian aid to Israel, something, as Cotton will point out, no other country on earth in any war in the entire history of the human race has ever been called on to do. But let's go to Tom Cotton right now, and then I might have a few quick comments after.
Chair recognizes the Senator from Arkansas.
Well, here we go again. Hamas is on the verge of defeat, so it's cranked up the propaganda machine once again. Now, Hamas wants the world to believe that Israel has undertaken a campaign of deliberate starvation of the Gazan population. And as usual, Hamas can count on an international media and political chorus to fight their battles for them and try to bully Israel into submission. So I'd like to set the record straight. First, let me observe that no decent person wants to see innocent children caught in the crosshairs of war and suffering from hunger and malnutrition. Israel agrees, of course. That's why, since Hamas started this war with its brutal atrocities, Israel has helped bring into Gaza approximately 96,000 trucks containing nearly 1.5 million tons of food, 46,000 tons of medical supplies, 60,000 tons of water, and around 170,000 tons of shelter equipment. Put simply, children in Gaza aren't going hungry because of a lack of supplies from Israel. They're suffering because Hamas uses food and humanitarian aid as a weapon to stay in power. Now, you may see these easels next to me and believe I'm about to show you heart-wrenching images of malnourished kids. That's what some more gullible senators have done lately, and I'm afraid to say gullible might be a charitable way to describe their motives. Much like the New York Times buying hook, line, and sinker the images of Gazan children afflicted with terrible diseases, but passed off as malnourished. But no, I have other images to show, namely the immense volume of food that's being ruthlessly withheld from the children of Gaza. Pallets and pallets of United Nations aid are just waiting to be distributed to the children of Gaza. Some of these contain canned goods, such as chickpeas, white beans, green peas, and carrots. But these supplies, at this very moment, are sitting and baking in the hot sun instead of feeding hungry kids. While this situation is shocking, it's not at all surprising. After all, Hamas's infiltration of UN aid mechanisms is well documented. Time and again, we have seen Hamas terrorists divert aid shipments to themselves or loot delivery trucks, only to resell the supplies on the black market at outrageous prices. Last year, this terrorist-infiltrated aid system, managed by the UN and others, allowed Hamas to rake in more than $500 million in profit. Profits that fund Hamas's campaign of terror against Israel and its own people. How critical is this systematic theft to Hamas's grip on power? Well, one of Hamas's chief demands in recent ceasefire negotiations has been the dismantling of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a new charity created specifically to end Hamas's stranglehold on aid and supplies. The foundation has even offered to distribute UN aid for free, despite the risk to its own people. And much of this aid, which is sitting in the sun and partly taxpayer funded, is already inside Gaza. It simply needs to be picked up and distributed. But the offer has fallen on deaf ears because Hamas uses humanitarian aid as a tool to fund, facilitate, and fight its war against innocent children, against Israel, against the civilized world. And Hamas's cheerleaders, apologists, and dupes in Europe and America, and sadly here in the U.S. Senate, once again turn a blind eye to Hamas's crimes, blaming instead Israel and the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. They demand that Israel agree to a ceasefire that preserves and rewards Hamas, while also delivering even more humanitarian aid to Gaza for Hamas to steal and exploit. They expect Israel to feed the very people who attacked, raped, and murdered innocent Israeli men, women, and children on October 7th. And I would remind everyone, not a few American victims as well. Once again, Israel is facing demands placed on no other nation in the world. I don't recall from my history lessons, for instance, the United States providing humanitarian aid to Germany and Japan in World War II. On the contrary, the Allies imposed naval blockades that led to widespread shortages in those enemy nations. When, in the annals of history, has the victim of an unprovoked war of aggression ever been held responsible for the nutrition of the aggressor? Put simply, Israel doesn't have any responsibility to send a single loaf of bread to Gaza. I wonder why so many senators, pundits, podcasters, and European politicians impose this unique standard on the Jewish nation. Why could it be? But despite all that, despite the brutal slaughter of nearly 1,200 Israelis on October 7th, despite Hamas's continued repression of its own people, Israel is still delivering aid to Gaza, while Hamas rips it from the hands of hungry children. Once again, we see very simply and very clearly in this war who is on the side of justice and who is on the side of evil. And I would ask anyone who places these singular demands on Israel, whose side do you want to be on? And if you truly care about the children of Gaza, as I do, as Israelis do, as any decent person surely does, I would encourage you to support President Trump's statement of moral clarity and strength from earlier this morning. The fastest way to end the humanitarian crises in Gaza is for Hamas to surrender and release the hostages. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
That was Tom Cotton explaining the whole idea of humanitarian aid better than any more. I've never heard an explanation. This just shows you how biased the media is, because I've never heard anybody just state the simple fact that Israel is not required to do what no other country on earth ever in the history of warfare has done, and that's to provide aid to an enemy. And that brings us now, I just want to throw in something or add something that Cotton didn't. He touched on it, but he didn't give you the complete details. So I'm going to give you some complete details now about humanitarian law. Now, when you're talking about, well, the thumbnail for this video showed the cover of the Geneva Convention. When you're talking about humanitarian law, you're talking about the Geneva Convention. So what does the Geneva Convention say about international law? Now, as Tom Cotton said, there is no blanket requirement for any country to, well, first of all, I've read all these people who are criticizing Israel. It's clear to me they've never read a word of the Geneva Convention. Okay, so a little bit about, because I have read. Okay, and for instance, well, the main point is that warfare sometimes is unavoidable. Okay, it becomes necessary, and the whole idea of the Geneva Convention is to make it, on the one hand, to make it as, say, humane. I know that sounds like a non sequitur, but to make war as humane as possible by, for instance, requiring bullets, full metal jacket bullets. In other words, not like a pure lead bullet, such as in the Civil War, where people were, you get hit anywhere in your arm, you lose the arm because it's a pure lead ball that expands and expends all its energy inside the body of whoever gets hit by one of those bullets. So they're full metal jacket. They have, they have the big bullets. They have points on them, but they have the lead is coated so that the bullet will not expand. It goes straight through. It punches a hole. Of course, it kills, but the idea is that you want to wound or kill an enemy, but you don't want to there's no point in mangling an enemy. You understand? So that's one thing. But then the matter of humanitarian aid now, and there are two main points or tenets of the Geneva Convention. Number one, there's three actually. The Geneva Convention is a convention signed by what's called high contracting parties. Okay, high contracting parties, which means a state, which means a government, it means a signatory, such as the United States. We signed the Geneva Convention. Hamas is not a state. They have not signed the Geneva Convention. So actually, the Geneva Convention does not apply to them. So on the one hand, when they're holding hostages and they're violating the numerous violations of the Geneva Convention, you could say, well, then they are they're not a signatory. They're not bound by the Geneva Convention, but that applies to Israel too, in the sense that Israel is dealing with a country that is not a signatory. And the whole point behind the whole logic behind having the Geneva Convention is, well, if I'm a state, if I torture your prisoners the prisoners of war that I get from you, then you'll do the same thing to me. It's self-enforcing. That's what I mean. There's no court really that enforces it. It's just a common sense that what you do to me, I'll do to you. And there's just an agreement, for instance, not to use poison gas, mustard gas, and chlorine, as was used in World War I, which is one of the things that led to the Geneva Convention. But that's one tenet. The other one, another main tenet, second of three, is that the combatants, I have the right, if I'm the country, if I'm the United States of America, say, I have the right to pursue my enemy wherever the enemy is. That is a key tenet of the Geneva Convention. If you hide, as Hamas does, among civilians, I have a right to go get you wherever you are, to attack you, especially if you're hiding behind civilians and shooting at me. That's common sense. But there are other things, there are obligations on each side this is the third tenet, to protect their own, each side protects its own civilians. So one of the ways you're supposed to protect your civilians is that the combatants wear uniforms and carry weapons openly, so you can distinguish between an enemy, a combatant, and a civilian, and you can target it's easier to target the combatant and not the civilian. But of course, as I just said, you could still have collateral killing or wounding of a civilian if the combatant hides behind the civilians. But something you notice, most, let's say the United States military, they wear uniforms, and then they go, when they're not fighting and not on the base, not serving, they go home on leave or whatever, then they like to change into their civilian clothes. Hamas, it's exactly the opposite. When there's no fighting, if there's a truce or something, they parade around in their nice white, not white, but clean, nicely pressed uniforms, and they carry their weapons openly and all that. But when the fighting starts, they do the opposite of what any other civilized military does. They change into civilian clothes deliberately to make it hard for Israel to distinguish between a combatant and a civilian, because they're dressed the same way. And if they're concealing weapons, that makes it even harder if they're not carrying them openly. But the point is that Hamas is responsible for the civilians being killed, because they are not separating. They're hiding behind the civilians and not separating. Now we get to, I guess I got off on a little. I just want to, because so many people, it just gets me. So many people have not read the Geneva Convention, and they talk, or conventions actually, plural, and they keep talking about humanitarian law. So now we get to aid, like providing food and aid. And Cotton was a little bit wrong. I have to correct him. He says that Israel is not required to provide aid. Well, that's not entirely true. They are required. Israel is required. Well, not to Hamas, because they're not a signatory and they're not obeying the convention. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that they are. So then, when Israel is required to provide humanitarian aid, provided one, two, three conditions are met. Any one of the three of these 1, 2, 3 conditions are not met, then Israel does not have to provide the aid. That's what Cotton is missing. What are these 3 conditions? Okay, I give them to you right now. Number one, that none of the aid, well, the way the conventions reads, it's Article 23, by the way, if you want to look it up. I mean, it's a long convention. If you don't want to read the whole thing, it's Article 23, okay, about providing humanitarian aid. And what it is that Israel must provide humanitarian aid unless it fears, number one, that a combatant could get some of the aid. In other words, well, we know Hamas is stealing aid. And that could be another vlog to show you videos, because you had some idiots saying it was a U.S. government, part of our government. You're actually saying, well, there's no looting of aid. So maybe you can find plenty of videos of Hamas looting aid. But the point is, though, that Hamas cannot receive. If they receive a morsel of food, if they steal 1 can of beans, well, Israel does not have to provide the food, because they only have to provide. That's why we have this the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation now distributing food instead of UNRWA and the United Nations, because giving it to them to distribute. Some of you may recall, apparently a lot of people have forgotten, that a lot of employees, UNRWA, also were moonlighting as they were members of Hamas. If you give it to UNRWA, in fact, either Trump or somebody in our government just called, I think it was Trump, though, or Trump. Well, the article said Trump administration said, dismantle UNRWA. They're totally useless, and giving food to UNRWA to distribute is like giving it to Hamas. And in fact, there is somebody, if you're talking about not getting food or another, you can also blame, as somebody pointed out, I think some of the trucks have already moved, but there were 950 trucks, United Nations trucks, on the Gaza side of the border, but not being distributed, because the United Nations doesn't want to distribute it unless they can distribute it. Very simple. Just give it to Gaza, who I'll use the initials, GHF, give it to them to distribute. Very simple. And in fact, to mention GHF, the morning of the day I'm recording this, which is Friday, our ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, and then the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, they're touring the GHF, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the food distribution points. And So far I haven't had time to do any, extensive reading. I'll read later tonight, but the initial reports, at least from Huckabee, very positive that GHF is doing. They have, well, last figure I saw was 95 million. So we have to be up to 40 because they were distributing about a million, over a million meals or food packages a day. So they are doing a good job. Just give it to them. But anyways, the point is these three tenets. So number one, if there's any chance, actually, not if there's any chance. Remember what the convention said. You can look it up. Article 23. Israel cannot fear that Hamas might not actually get, but if Israel has a fear, reasonable fear, which they do, just a reasonable fear that Hamas could get a can of beans, they don't have to distribute the food, period. End of story. That's number one condition. Number two condition is that Israel has to fear that Hamas, in other words, as I said earlier, each side is responsible for its own civilians. Hamas is responsible for distributing the food, and that is and Israel is the second condition if Israel fears that Hamas does not have any food. We know there are no starving Hamas terrorists. All right. So the second condition is that Hamas must distribute all 100% of all of its food. Then when the terrorists, Hamas, when every one of them is starving, has no food to give to provide the Gazans, that would be a second condition. Okay. And so that would be, so we know, number one, fear that Hamas cannot get the food. And obviously, if they cannot get any food, then eventually you reach a point where Hamas will be starving and they will have no food to distribute. But right now they have food to distribute. So that's second condition, not met. And number three, Israel has to be able to control the distribution of the food. Now that condition is being met because they, working with the United, with us, this is an American company, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and Israel's working with them. So Israel is not distributing the food, but they are, you could say they are controlling the food because the GHF is distributing the food in Israel. They are working with GHF. So that condition is met. But there are two that are not met, and all three have to be met before Israel is required to give, even, as I said, a can of beans to the Gazans. Now, so the point is, now, Israel, will they do that? They won't do that because, well, some of them don't want to do it. They don't have to do it. I mean, it's fair. Siege warfare is a legitimate form of warfare. It's been used since the beginning of time, I'm sure, as long as there's been warfare, which is you cut off the supplies here. We did it in the Civil War, the siege of Vicksburg. The Confederates, the civilians, never mind the soldier, but the civilians, Grant, U.S. Grant, he surrounded Vicksburg. He initiated a siege, and while bombarding at the same time, constant bombardment from cannon, while cutting off any aid, any food to the city, and the civilians of Vicksburg were living on rats. They were eating rats. That's how bad it got, and maybe they ran out of rats. Who knows about that? But they eventually surrendered unconditionally. But that's what happened. We've done it, and as I said, every country, siege warfare is, as I said, if they're being humane, if they're doing it following humanitarian law, that Israel is everybody's blaming Israel for not following, even though they are. Hamas has food, and Hamas has to distribute the food. Now, when Hamas puts up a white flag and says, comes out and says, look, we've been feeding our population, the civilians, but we ran out of food. We don't have it. And then they can make arrangement with Israel to give food to the civilians, but not one can of beans, not one bean, let alone a can of beans, to any terrorists. That is the law. So if Israel's doing this, because Israel is being, the point is that all these people criticizing Israel should be praising Israel. Say you don't have to do this, and you're doing it, and we praise you for it. Which was the whole point of the reason we have Hamas in this war is, I guess it's going to be a long vlog today, is because Israel was Ariel Sharon was the prime minister at the time. Israelis were living in Gaza. They had some communities there, settlements, and Hamas, Sharon, or at Muya, you could go find old videos. I'm sure I saw them at the time of Israeli soldiers physically dragging Israeli civilians out of Gaza. And the whole point of doing that was everybody told Israel, they're occupiers, blah, blah, the whole story. And they said, well, so Sharon said, okay, well, we're going to leave Gaza, expecting that the world would thank them and praise them for that and say, okay, start. So they withdrew from, one area, and just the opposite. Just ask them to create a terrorist state in Judea and Samaria. Just they got no praise for doing that, and that was one of the reasons for doing it. And they got no praise, but what they did get was Hamas, okay, and thousands of rockets. And then October 7, 2023, 1,200 massacred, 250 taken prisoner. Many, I'll estimate, about half of them died. So that's what they got for it. And now you have all these countries, France, the most useless country in the world, in my opinion. And so all these countries are going to they're going to reward Hamas with these recognizing a Palestinian state that doesn't physically exist anywhere. And so, and they say, don't deny it. We're not trying to help Hamas. Well, simple fact for you, I would like to ask one of these, President Macron personally, if October 7th hadn't happened, if Hamas had not invaded Israel and massacred 1,200 Israelis, taken 250 prisoners, and if Israel had not, as France did, fought back, the Allies fought back against Nazi Germany, and would that? Why I just don't see the comparison, it's why I guess what I was saying is that if all that hadn't happened, would France and all these other countries be recognizing a Palestinian state? Sorry, I lost my thought for a second. That's why this is called Gene Rants. I rant sometimes and I'll lose my train of thought. The point I was making was that that if all that hadn't happened, then would today all these countries be recognizing a Palestinian state? And no, things would be the way they were on October 6th, 2023, before this happened. So don't tell me that they're not doing this because of Hamas. And another reason they're doing this, which will be another vlog I got my head to do, is they're dhimmis. Now, what is a dhimmi? You want to know? A dhimmi is a Christian or a Jew, or a Christian and a Jew living under Muslim rule. Basically, Islam, if you follow the Quran exactly, which these people do, if you're not a Muslim, you have three choices. There's a fourth. You could convert to Islam. Okay, that's one choice. But if you don't do that, and if you don't convert, if you're, if you're a Hindu or something, a polytheist, your choice is convert or die. Only two choices. But if you're a Jew or a Christian, you're what they call, Muslims call, people of the book. And you have a third choice, which is to be a second-class citizen, be humiliated, live under the thumb of Islam, not have the rule same. Well, for instance, not being able to carry a weapon. There was one town where where Jews were not allowed, or Christians allowed, to ride a camel, because that would put their heads higher than the head of a Muslim on the ground. If a Muslim is walking down the street, and towards you, and you are a Jew or a Christian, you have to step aside, get off the street. You cannot hold public office. In some towns, they were made to wear, Jews at least were made to wear specially designed clothing. They could only wear specially designed clothing with very high armholes. In other words, they would be uncomfortable all the time. Plus, they had to pay what's called in Christians do something called a jizya, which is basically a poll tax. In other words, just for being Jewish or Christian, you had to pay a tax every year that Muslims did not have to pay. You could not. You did not have to tear down a church, for instance, but you could not, if a church, if you could not repair a church that fell into disrepair. In one town, if a Muslim, if you're a Christian or a Jew, and a Muslim is like a traveler, he wants to stay, you have to let him stay in your house if he wants to for 3 days. Okay, all these rules. And so the point I was getting to is France seems to be heading that way, and England too. They allowed all these unvetted Muslims who have no interest in assimilating to become French and become westernized, and now a lot of them are violent, and a lot of them, they're afraid of them. Dimitude, that's basically it. In many respects, the England and France is, I mean, there's a reason why some people call London Londonistan, because of how it's changed. John Cleese, remember from Monty Python, he says he goes back, he goes to London sometimes, and he doesn't know he's in London. But and contrast that with this country, America. I worked with Muslims all the time, with Arabs all the time when I was a real estate broker in New York City, because a lot of store owners, deli owners and other owners, restaurant owners, a lot of them are Arabs, and so I worked with them, and we got along very fine. And that's because, well, everyone, of all the Muslims I've met, I mean, you see all these demonstrations in the on the street. These Palestine and again anti-American demonstrations. I never met a single Muslim in New York City. The ones I personally met who did not absolutely love. I mean, love the United States. They just loved the United States. I had a close friend. He was an American citizen, and then I remember one day they were, talking about how he was about, later that day he would be celebrating a friend who, became an American citizen, was naturalized on that day or soon, right before. So and you look at Israel. I guess I'm getting a lot out today. Israel is 20% non-Jewish. Okay, 20%, and as I said in the past, 2/3 people of color. By the way. So this idea of white colonialists, I've talked about that before. You can dig up the video. But the point is, you have 20% of Israel is Arab, and they work together, they live together. 40% of the pharmacists in Israel are Arabs. They are they doctors, Arab. You find yourself in a hospital. There's an Arab judge on the what they call it, the High Court, the high equivalent to our Supreme Court. On and on. But you look at France and Germany and all these countries, and they have, once they get above I don't know, about 3% or something of Muslim immigration, they start having problems, and they don't want to report crime figures. They don't want to. Denmark is finally getting smart, and it's, I don't know. I guess I got off my main point, which is that Israel is doing not just as required by humanitarian law, as Cotton explained, they have gone way above what they are required to do. And I guess the point I will end on, I hope, because I keep thinking of new points to bring up, but I think these people criticizing Israel, they know it. They know that Israel is doing everything more than it's required to do. They just hate Israel, and they shout like genocide. You don't provide 95 million to meals aid packages to people you're trying to. That's what genocide is. I mean, they see people. I talked about this the other day, misusing definitions, words. Genocide means eliminating an entire people. It was invented for, it was a term applied for what never happened before in history, which was the Holocaust, 6 million Jews, and was obvious an attempt by Hitler to kill all the Jews, organized killing, concentration camps where they were brought there specifically just to be killed. And then you had, they were already the Mufti of Jerusalem at that time, which was the British mandate. He visited. There's photos of him with Hitler. The idea was to, if Hitler had won the war, the Nazis had won, to expand the Holocaust to the Middle East. That is genocide. Now you have Israel. They're providing, number one, millions of meals, but hundreds of millions by now. And now you have Huckabee and Witkoff, who are working, well, first of all, reporting what's actually happening there, which is actually positive what's happening there, number one. But number two, to work with the Israelis to provide even more food. That's not genocide. And then finally, as I said, Israel is 20% Arab. I would say there's a small number of those are Christian Arabs, who, by the way, a lot of them, they don't want to be called Arabs anymore. They want to, so if we can call Syrians and Egyptians who immigrated to between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, if we can call them Palestinians, then we can certainly honor the wish of Christian Israelis who want to be called Arameans and not Arab Christians anymore. That's how disgusted they are with what the Palestinians are doing. But there's not, and by the way, Israel is the only country in the Middle East where the Christian population is not just increasing, but flourishing. They're almost extinct everywhere else in the Middle East. They've been, and other countries too, being persecuted out of, it's tragic, and nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about that because Israel isn't doing it. So Israel, on the other hand, Christian population is doing fine, and I mean and Arabs too. They volunteer for they're not required to. Jewish Israelis are subject to the draft in the army. Arabs are not. And for the simple reason is that Israel, again, and supposedly is Israel bent on genocide. They don't want to put Arabs in the position of being ordered to kill other Arabs. So they have a choice, but they join anyways. So the point is that if Israel was bent on genocide, there are, I think, 2 million Arabs in Israel. It should be zero, right? I mean, that was the idea. That was the goal of the Nazis in Germany. That's genocide, to have the Jewish population everywhere in the world, but starting in Germany, to be zero. Israel, no. The population is substantially Arab population is substantially larger than zero. And that's it for today. Thanks for stopping by. If you watched this far, great. If you watch this at all, great, because I've noticed that whenever if I talk about politics, I get a certain amount of views. If I talk about the Middle East or Israel, I get almost no views. Maybe this will be an exception. Anyways, the important thing was Tom Cotton, so I put him at the beginning. That's it today for sure. Your comments welcome in the comment section below the video, unless, since we're talking about Israel, unless if it's anti-Semitic, I'll delete it. But if it's just critical of Israel or me, I'll I won't delete it. I don't do that. One time I did by accident, and then I invited that person to to repost. Just put the post in again. I hit the wrong delete. I meant to delete my own reply, and I accidentally deleted the whole thing. Anyways, so your comments welcome. If you could subscribe, that would really be great. Share this video with anyone you think would benefit from it. But most of all, come back and see me again. I would love to see all of you again, and until hopefully in a less ranting mood. But I'd love to see all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.